Hello, hello, hello. Hi, how's everyone? Good, you look good. It's cold outside, you look warm. Nice to have you here. My name is Joel Whitney. I'm part of the team here at BPL Presents. We do the arts and culture events. We knock things over. Welcome to those of you who are here in person. Nice to see you. Those we can't see on the live stream at home, you're also welcome here. And before we turn this over to this vibrant discussion of pirate enlightenment, just going to remind you of some things, how you can keep in touch with us. Cool? This will be streamed to our BPL Presents page, and all of our social media handles are at BPL Presents. And you can see our exciting forthcoming winter season at bklynlibrary.org/BPL Presents. And you'll see we have a series coming up called University Open Air, which is all migrant immigrant professors who teach classes in the summer months, al fresco in Prospect Park, and we have a different way that we do that that's equally compelling in the winter. We have Lit Film coming up in a couple weeks. It's a film festival where all the films are about writers and writing, and sometimes editors, including the new Lizzie Gottlieb film, Turn Every Page. We'll close with that one. So look for all that on our website, and once again, welcome. Tonight, Virginia Heffernan, Edward Angueso, and Gideon Lewis Krause and Andrew Ross will discuss David Graeber's Pirate Enlightenment, or The Real Libertalia, the final posthumous work by the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, The Dawn of Everything. And our friends at Greenlight are selling it in the lobby, including some of the other books of our panelists. We hope you'll pick some up on the way out. And I'm going to let you hear us get on with it, but I'm going to introduce two people. Our moderator, who will come up second, Gideon Lewis Krause, is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He grew up in New Jersey. He writes reportage and criticism and is the author of the digressive travel memoir, A Sense of Direction, as well as the Kindle single, No Exit. Previously, he was a writer at large at the New York Times Magazine, a contributing editor at Harper's Magazine, and a contributing writer at Wired. Gideon co-edited with Arnie Eisen, Philip Reif's Sacred Order, Social Order 3, and edited Richard Rorty's Philosophy as Cultural Politics. He teaches a reporting seminar in the graduate writing program at Columbia, and he's lived in San Francisco, Berlin, where he was a 2007-2008 Fulbright Fellow, and Shanghai, and now lives here in Brooklyn with his wife and two small children. But before we kick this all off, Nika Dubrovsky will come up and welcome us with some personal thoughts. And Nika is an artist and author. She writes children's books for adults and adult books for kids. David Graeber and Nika have collaborated on the essay series Another World of Art, books in the anthropology for kids, Who Are the Kings, Who Are the Pirates, The Illustrated History of Uprisings, and more, and a series of art initiatives such as the Yes Women Group and the Museum of Care. Please welcome Nika.
So I'm so glad that this book is out finally in English. And I think David would be really happy now. It's also translated already to the several languages, and more translations are coming. And yeah, I just want to thank you so much, Mel Fleshman and Eric Chimsky, and many other people who was working on this book. Thank you. So the other thing I want to say that we set up an institute of David Graeber in London that I will slowly transfer to this institute David's archive, and we're starting from the notebooks from Madagascar, where lots of pictures and notes that he was taking. But archive is vast, and the institute will be very small. So it will only have two projects. One is archive, and another is a brain trust, climate change project that he started in the last year of his life. And yeah, the pirate book is part of his legacy, and it's extremely important because it's a third book of the trilogy. Started from There Never Was the West, then Dawn of Everything, and now finally Pirate Enlightenment. And it's a kind of a strange book because it's an alternative history in a way of how two worlds, the new and the old, could match without destroying. So that's, I hope it will be interesting discussion. And I want to invite also everyone on the 1st of April, Institute and FSG and Penguin will host online events that will spread throughout the year. It will be every month, one event. And so if anybody is working in a library, on a bookshop, or in cultural center, please contact us and we will distribute some materials and invite you to join us on Zoom on this series of talks. And in this Saturday, on the 28th, in New York, in the Earth Church, Avenue C, 36 Avenue C, we will host the open dinner and we will share food and sing and pray for the earth. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those lovely introductions, and thank you to all of you guys for being here tonight with us. Thanks also to the sponsors. So, few brief introductions of our panelists. Eddie Anguezo is co-host of This Machine Kills, a podcast that critically examines our technology, its design, funding, development, and deployment. Formerly a staff writer at Motherboard, Vice's technology section, his work focuses on the political economy of technology, finance, crypto, the gig economy, and Silicon Valley. Virginia Heffernan writes a monthly column and regular features for Wired, where she recently profiled David Wengrow. She is also a frequent contributor to the LA Times, The Atlantic, The Economist, and MSNBC. She has written for The New York Times since 2001. Her most recent book is Magic and Loss, The Internet as Art. She has hosted several podcasts about politics and culture, notably Trumpcast on Slate and This is Critical on Stitcher. In 2003, she received a PhD in English from Harvard. Andrew Ross is a social activist and professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. A contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, The Nation, and Al Jazeera, he's the author or editor of more than 25 books, including Sunbelt Blues, The Failure of American Housing, Bird on Fire, Lessons from the World's Least Sustainable City, Stone Men, The Palestinians Who Built Israel, The Celebration Chronicles, Life, Liberty, and Property Values in Disney's Newtown, and Fast Boat to China, Lessons from Shanghai. His most recent book, co-authored with Julie Livingston, is Cars and Jails, Freedom Dreams, Debt, and Carcerality. He is a co-founder of several advocacy groups, including the Debt Collective. So thank you very much to the panelists for being here this evening. And I think it was decided that each panelist would like to make some informal opening remarks. So, Virginia, you want to start?
I won't drag it out. Gideon's already told me I talk too much. All right.
We were just having a discussion about the nature of moderation in the context of Graeber's work. And I said that I thought Graeber would want moderators to know their role and to be more retiring.
I wanted to hear from Gideon. All right. Although David Graeber, as you all know, liked to spin out ideas at length, he had a talent for epigrams. Who can get enough of the meme, #bullshitjobs, especially someone like me who's worked as an editorial director for a marketing incubator. And everyone loves the clarity of surely one need not pay one's debts. That is, every debtor loves it. Who knows what creditors think? Mysterious. But I think Graeber has outdone himself in Pirate Enlightenment with one truly standout line. It's suitable for needlepoint. Ready? Everyone hates a long essay. Everyone loves a short book. I mean, this must be universally true. And this short book, Pirate Enlightenment, is supremely lovable. So as a one-time and lapsed literary critic, I'm drawn to the idea of, especially of exploits in Pirate Enlightenment. Of course, Graeber, with his somewhat unorthodox idea of economics, namely that it didn't exist as a field, it doesn't exist as a field, is quick to label most every economic interaction as exploitative. And as he points out early in the book, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas he hopes to redeem, are linked today with little besides imperialism and exploitation. But the word exploits, with that different emphasis, also threads through Graeber's work, including Dawn of Everything and this. While pirate enlightenment has a highly cohesive hypothesis, namely that some Enlightenment ideas attributed to the intellectual backwaters of England and France, I love that, intellectual backwaters of England and France, so good, they in fact originated with the pirates of Madagascar and their descendants. The book also goes into proof of this thesis, and that's where Graeber really lets loose. I think we miss the boat when we just think about the first 100 pages of Dawn of Everything or the memes that came out of Debt or Bullshit Jobs. The proof, the stories, is where he really shines. Some people like their TED-ready idea or their bankable memes, and some people like the stories. I think Graeber likes the stories. Ultimately, his extraordinary synthesis of archaeological and anthropological records, rumors, letters, semi-fictional accounts, fiction passing as history, fiction made from whole cloth, outrageous myth-making, and all other manner of flotsam and jetsam. These are stories of exploits. But what are exploits? What is it to exploit these stories in another medium, as people exploit novels for movies or an anthropology dissertation for a popular piece of pleasure reading? One of my favorite of Graeber's exploit stories is the one of the Hungarian conman Benyavsky, I know Eddie likes this one too, who in the late 18th century passed himself off first as a Polish count and then as an outright monarch, having paid various villagers with money he had conned out of Louis XV to testify that he was the king of Madagascar. Because royal authorities back in France didn't quite believe Benyavsky's reports, he hired a spy and a slave trader to provide details about Madagascar from the ground. In other words, as Graeber writes, the first ethnographic accounts we have of Madagascar are notes written by a spy in order to allow a con man to better fabricate accounts of his non-existent exploits. That is the kind of document that David Graeber loved. Graeber's forever emphasizing here and elsewhere that historians keep missing the fun for the dull. He introduces Pirate Enlightenment not as a monograph, but as an account of his own exploits in research, studying magic, lies, sea battles, purloined princesses, slave revolts, manhunts, make-believe kingdoms, and fraudulent ambassadors, spies, jewel thieves, prisoners, devil worship, and sexual obsession. And all this, he says, lies at the heart of modern freedom. And we should notice that where there are slave uprisings, there are also slave traders. Where there are purloined princesses, there is also rape. So this is not just some happy fraternity, in bandanas. In uncovering the Zana Malata influence on the civilization formerly known as Western, Graeber in this book may have shades of Alan Lomax to him. Like Lomax, he finds source chords, techniques, and melodies in music that has been mistranslated or garbled or diluted. And then there's the goad this book gives to other minds. In the piece that Gideon mentioned, as I tooled around Dublin with Graeber's co-author on Dawn of Everything, David Wengrow, for a profile, I noticed how enthusiastic young Graeber fans were about both Graeber's work, but also how much they had inspired radical work on their part. One of his legacies is his proof that the Enlightenment was not primarily a European object or project. Another is to show that humans are primarily creatures of the imagination, not programmed, naturally or somehow culturally imaginative, satirical, ironic. And with both of these ideas firmly in mind, I myself was inspired to chase down another part of the non-Western Enlightenment story, and I think I'll try it on you. On a recent trip to Taiwan, I've been writing about lithography on atoms, the making of silicon chips. And once the CEO of the semiconductor family talked about atoms as the face of God, which he also said is the face of nature. God and nature are one. I started to wonder if there was any way that some Enlightenment deism could have originated in Taiwan. I was really trying to think like Graeber. Sure enough, I found a tantalizing thread I'm hoping one day to pull, that just at the time the Dutch East India Company had colonized the island of Taiwan, and its merchants and financiers were mixing it up with indigenous inhabitants who were animists and deists, Spinoza was back in Amsterdam, proposing that God and nature are one and the same. Graeber starts the book by saying, I hope the reader has as much fun as I did. A beautiful way to remember Graeber, setting a high bar for fun that, if it can ever be reached, will no doubt happen while we're savoring tales of Graeber's intellectual exploits.
Virginia said everything I wanted to say, so I'll keep it short in that, this book is really fascinating to me. I hope you give it a read. It's part of, as we'll talk about here, as the book talks about, as reviews will talk about, it's part of a larger project that, Graeber was engaged in trying to flesh out the, actual foundations of this world, which has been really important. Because it's only through understanding the origins of the ideas that we have and the institutions that we have do we begin to realize how they're not as inevitable or as frozen as we might think otherwise, and that there are alternatives, there are ways out to create a better world, and one that can allow all of us to flourish as we'd like. And this one focuses on, or uses the pirates to kind of continue that project of saying, well, the Enlightenment is, really an intellectual movement or founded on conversation and discussion, that in places on the edges of empires, you'd see people finally start to experiment with and take seriously ideas about how to organize their lives and relate to each other in different ways, and experiment with liberty, experiment with freedom, experiment with autonomy. So I'll just read a small section from the conclusion that I think kind of summarizes the project here. It should be borne in mind, too, that the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement uniquely tied to conversational forums. This is not just of the salons and coffee houses from which its ideas emerged, but even of the prose style developed, particularly in France, which was witty, light, and conversational, as if propelled by a faith that all intractable social and intellectual problems could melt away in the clear light of intelligent discussion. Were pirate kingdoms and pirate utopias being discussed in the salons of Paris under Louis XV? It's hard to imagine that they weren't, since at the time they were being discussed virtually every place else. How did the discussions inform the, for them, revolutionary conclusions reached by some of those attending those saloons about the nature of liberty, authority, sovereignty, and the people? We can only guess. What I've tried to do in this book is to simply point out that until now, we haven't even been asking questions like this. We have constructed a theoretical language that makes it almost impossible to do so. But if, as I once suggested, political action is best defined as action that influences others, at least some of whom are not present at the time, that is, influences others by being talked about, narrated, sung, drawn, written, or otherwise represented, then pirates, women traders, and Mpok Jaka on the northeast coast of Madagascar around the turn of the 18th century were global political actors in the fullest sense of the term.
Is that it? Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for coming along this evening. Unless Nina knows of some other large manuscript lying around, this might be the last long-form piece of writing of David's that we have the pleasure of reading, which is really sad. Who is left to let us know that everything that we thought about topic A or B is entirely wrong, and they will now tell us why. That seems to me to be the modus operandi that David employed, in a series of remarkable books, really beginning with a long volume on debt, where the sacred cow in question was the myth of barter, all the way up to this book where, as we've learned, as perhaps the received wisdom that's being targeted is this assumption of ours that the Enlightenment was a European project hatched in Paris and Königsberg and Edinburgh, and he challenges this with speculation about experimental forms of governance in pirate-descended communities on the east coast of Madagascar in the late 17th and early 20th century. There's several moments in the book where you come across a quintessential Graeberism. In fact, none of the standard view on this matter stands up to scrutiny. Right? We all recognize that, and we know what's coming. And I want to think about what kind of pleasure is involved in setting the reader up like that, with that method, because that was his method of writing. And I think it's worth noting that it's quite different from, what we call historical revisionism, where, unheard voices, neglected voices are given their due, or where some dominant theory of historical events is overturned by new scholarly evidence. Now, David drew very heavily on scholarship, no question, but he didn't write the way most scholars write. His preferred mode was intentional provocation. And with the goal of overturning some crusty paradigm that prevents us from thinking about radical alternatives. And the paradigm in question here is what's bequeathed to us by historians about this confederation on the east coast of Madagascar, which what's come down to us is that this was a kingdom, a unified kingdom, and was the creation of a single charismatic individual who was the king. David speculates otherwise. He suggests that this was a decentralized grassroots democracy without social ranks, whose roots can be traced to versions of proletarian freedom espoused by freebooting buccaneers and the like. And also that this king was in fact not a real king, but what is a real king? This king didn't really have much authority at all. In other words, an ideal kind of anarchist society, right? Now, I can think of many authors, several of them anarchists, who also shared this mode, this taste for provocation, let's say. But none of them were as bold and inventive in their reach as David Graeber, and none of them succeeded in finding a foothold in the public mind in quite the way that he did. The concept of bullshit jobs, for example, almost instantly established itself in the popular terminology about work and workplaces. Now, I suspect this book may not have quite the same popular impact. What went down on the east coast of Madagascar 3 centuries ago is not going to touch people in quite the same way. But the book is important in other ways. And that's because, first of all, we're told by David that there's very little solid historical evidence for the topic that he writes about. Most of it is lost. Most of the knowledge is lost, won't be recovered, and so he repeatedly tells us he cannot actually prove that the social arrangements that he approved of actually existed at that time and place. Even though the reader might suspect, and when you read the book, I'm sure you will suspect, that he believes that they did, his chief purpose is not to persuade us to do so. And unlike in the last book, The Dawn of Everything, which drew on new archaeological discoveries to dislodge old theories about social evolution, unlike that, there's unlikely to be any new physical evidence or new historical documents that are found about this period in Madagascar, that he tells us. So his goal is something else. His goal is really to show us how myth makers and historians have conspired to make it very difficult to imagine how this experimental democracy could have ever have existed. And even more unthinkable to imagine how it could have influenced conversations in the salons of Europe. And that sets off a chain reaction in our minds, or it did in my mind at least, and I'm sure it will in yours. And you start to think how many other social experiments throughout history have been rendered impossible to imagine precisely because of the limits placed on our imagination by some hidebound received wisdom or paradigm. And so I think, just to conclude, that the long-term impact of this book, and it's a very good read, by the way, this book. The publisher will be glad to hear me say this. It's a very good read. The long-term impact of this book probably will not be on what we think about Madagascar. It will be, and Virginia's already alluded to this, I think it will be on how it opens the doors to similar investigations by others along those lines, all of them inspired by David Graeber. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for all of those comments. Those were lovely and thoughtful, but I think we need to expect that nobody here has had a chance to read this book yet. So I think we probably need to take a step back and give people a more basic sense about what this book is about. So the questions here are, why is he interested in pirates? Who are the pirates that he's interested in? Where did they come from? Why are they in Madagascar? And what then do they do with their time in Madagascar that he thinks is relevant to this reconsideration of the Enlightenment project?
Those are terrifying questions. That's like asking a fan of Dawn of Everything. Like, tell me exactly where the Wendat were at these particular times. I mean, it's very hard. It's just hard to reconstruct. I could give a try, but Andrew, Eddie? You want to?
So the book hones in on a few levels. So the first is that pirates are in operation at the edges of these colonial empires at the turn of the 17th century, and Madagascar ends up becoming a central part because its position in the Indian Ocean, or its proximity to Indian Ocean, allows it as like a place for colonial fleets, but also for pirates who are raiding some of these trade routes to, refuel and, or as he puts it, refuel, and whether that be foods or supplies, whether that be to offload loot that they took from heist or from attacks on the ships, as well as participating in the slave trade in early phases of Madagascar's history. So Madagascar ends up being important because pirates need a place to dump all of the stolen loot, and you can't dump it just in London. You can't dump it in Paris. You can't dump it in Libsyn. You have to figure out some way to launder it, and one of the ways in which you can do it is in Madagascar by going to some of these ports that are established by pirates as they're entering into the communities of the Madagascar natives. Madagascar also is important, or it becomes interesting, because it's been a place where there have been waves of refugees, there have been waves of traders, there have been waves of populations of very disparate cultures and traditions coming in, but over time have nonetheless still been assimilated into some core Madagascar culture, the origins of which are unknown to us. And so on the political and a political question that emerges from that is like, what is the process by which these people on the continent, or sorry, on the island, are able to assimilate people from different cultures, and what are the political institutions or experiments that they're doing as a result of that? And what you find is, the pirates are coming in, they're creating communities, they're creating connections, and they end up, by virtue of interacting with people on the island, setting off a series of movements, wars, a sexual revolution, an uprising that create different types of political arrangements, forms of governance, whether it's like a decentralized form of governance, fake kingdoms that are used to keep colonial powers off their backs or to play them for loot or for more wealth. So at a large level, the interest there is, why did the pirates and their interactions set off these experiments into forms of governance that Europeans were just starting to think of. You know, why were people starting to try to create egalitarian societies or societies that where a ruler or a king didn't actually have the absolute power that a monarch in Europe might have? Why were people in Madagascar, especially in the communities and the political systems and the confederations that came up, having these sexual revolution in the autonomy of women? Why, what role did women have in power and political decision making? A lot of the questions, or a lot of the really interesting things that emerge in the Enlightenment and in Europe, are happening at the same time in this place as they are also in the Americas, and in a very condensed period of time, which makes it really interesting and easy place to kind of survey, even though we don't have much in the way of a record for that area.
That was perfect. There are Daniel Defoe, who notoriously passed his novels off as hard facts, wrote about Madagascar, it looks like, under a pseudonym. So there are things like that. They're like part fiction that he managed to sort of read through the way that he did with some of the dialogues in Enlightenment era dialogues in Dawn of Everything, to sort of hear the other voice in it, or how it might be refracted. But it's a very delicate kind of reading. And the other thing I'll say is I think it grows out of, well, you all may remember this idea in the Dawn of Everything, something like, our ancestors had fake kings and real autonomy, and now we have fake autonomy and real kings. And I think, right, that there is play kings was the original topic that he was working on with Stalin.
Mock kings.
Mock kings, okay. Sometimes he calls them play kings. That are, and that were very, and there were many of them in Madagascar. And he loves the idea of standing up hierarchy, satirizing hierarchy. So like people dressing up as kings and acting like kings. And then that project with Marshall Solins, his great collaborator and mentor, then this grew out of working on an essay or something about mock kings, something like that. Do I have it right? Anyway, that's the only thing I have to add. It was also his dissertation, his field work for his anthropology dissertation was in Madagascar. So, yeah.
Yeah, the only couple of things I would add, what the Pryors brought with them was their culture and their treasure. And both of these are very important in the story. A lot of scholarship that David was drawing on has excavated the nature of that culture. Aboard pirate ships, a lot of pirates became pirates as a result of mutinies, overturning authority on other ships. And the culture that they presented themselves to the outside world as, ruthless, barbaric predators, bloodthirsty, and so on and so forth. But in fact, their internal culture was very, I guess the term would be horizontal. And when they had to elect someone as the leader who would pretend to be the leader, at least to the outside world, or to ships that were being hijacked and their booty taken hostage, they would do so by election. And so there wasn't any sort of hierarchy, let's say. So obviously that's very important to this story about proto-anarchism. And they brought that culture with them, and it became
with them. Just if I stop you, with them from where? Because I think we're missing some part of the global scope of this story. Where did these pirates come from?
Well, from many points in the Indian Ocean.
Well, it's mostly the Caribbean. These are pirates who have come from the Caribbean, who have ended up in Madagascar.
They couldn't find. Yes, they couldn't. It was actually very difficult to get rid of their treasure. You couldn't fence those stolen goods very easily at the time. There wasn't any obvious circuit for doing that. And so I think that was part of the reason why this east coast of Madagascar became a haven in a way. And that treasure was, and that was the other thing they brought with them, obviously, that treasure was invested in all sorts of ways in building the infrastructure of these societies and settlements, as indeed they intermarried and became semi-indigenized. In fact, in some cases, completely indigenized.
That they begin in the Caribbean islands. That's their port of departure. The ships, and then they're
These pirates, yeah.
right.
They start in the Caribbean,
and then the
they're part of the
mutineers.
they're part of the transatlantic networks, and then because part of this idea is drawing the periphery closer to the center, right?
Yeah.
And so he's saying that this Madagascar was like this kind of Mos Eisley cantina of the Indian Ocean, where he calls it a moral gray zone, that this is where there's no real authority there. The European commercial interests don't really have a foothold there. There's kind of a fractured internal authority.
Yep.
So this is a place where pirates can hang out outside of most authority at an important juncture where ships are going around the Cape, and try to fence their goods. And then who helps them fence their goods?
Yeah. Well,
The women. The women of the Malagasy women end up being the money launderers of the story. And they use their commercial networks to get rid of the stolen goods that they can't dump anywhere else.
yeah.
Right?
I mean,
Am I wrong about this?
There are a lot of ways that things get back on ships, or they hitch rides with other kinds of ships, or they interact with. There's a big Muslim population. They find ways to trade things and then reintegrate them into Europe or into the Middle East or back, into the rest of the world. I mean, they're not laundered right there for trade there. Right? They're shipped out. Some of the things. The plunder.
I think, well, part of it, I think what Gideon's also referring to is, and one of the really interesting parts of the consequences of the pirates settling in the northeast coast is, pirates initially tried to come in, and there were a few ways of coming in and ingratiating yourself with the community, right? So you could come in and you could use force to try to weasel your way into getting deals with the natives of the island. And the Europeans tried to do that, and they were violently expelled. And the few times that they tried to set up settlements, you could come in and have communities where you largely kept to yourself, maybe intermarried within yourself, but still had some allies on the island. And this is what some of the Swahili coast traders were doing. And then you would also have what the pirates did, which is setting up communities, marrying with the locals, and eventually, having descendants who ended up becoming their own distinct ethnic group, the Zana Malta. And what ended up happening, or one of the key developments here that Graeber's really interested in, is over time, attempts were made. The way in which they ingratiated themselves was that the women of the island would marry and intermarry into these pirate communities. And one of the reasons why they were doing that is that they were also trying to take advantage of the pirates coming in with a lot of wealth, a lot of autonomy or power, and using that to try to create ports on the coast, what he called cities of women, where they were running commerce, they were running markets, they were running trading networks. And it was, the growing power of these cities of women that eventually would lead to a sort of backlash political development where, political entities led by, either patriarchal lineage clans or warrior princes would try to push back, build a confederation, or build a rival kingdom to compete with the power of the cities of women along the coast.
And the sexual revolution there is a really astonishing part, and like a really meaningful uprising against mandatory virginity at marriage. Just like radical protests. It's
Yeah, there's like a really interesting contradiction with the way that women are have political power or don't have political power inside of the society, because there's a section in the book where they talk about how women are treated as political tokens by Madagascar natives, where on the one hand they're seen as the ways in which to continue the lineage of groups that were, aristocratic inside of the society, but on the other hand, they were also seen as ways to, or women were used by men as ways to also take wealth or distribute wealth, which was in the form of, of ox. Basically, any fine, any penalty, any trade would have oxen as one part of it, and so women ended up in the situation trying to both get out of the narrow system of lineage and being married off exclusively to advance some of the political claims of these chiefs, but also trying to leverage the wealth that they were accumulating in these societies to try to either break away or have their own ambitions or build something else, which is part of what was the intention behind building some of these ports on the coast and doing trading with the pirates in the first place.
Can I just, there's a part, I'm glad you brought up this contradiction, because there's a part of it that I find inconsistent, and it's something we obviously won't know about ever. But it's suggested in the book that the evolution of the Confederation, the Inland Confederation, was very much an attempt to combat the power of the cities of women on the coast, right? So it certainly was not a utopia in that regard, this confederation. One of the central mechanisms of decision-making was the General Assembly, the Kabari. And there's a point in the book where there's some attention to whether women were excluded or not from the assembly. And in my recollection, it wasn't ultimately clear whether that was the case or not. Or whether he was just taking issue with a historian who assumed that that had been the case. But I wondered what you thought about that notion that the possible exclusion of women is a huge flaw in the thesis that this was a utopian confederation.
You all may remember from Dawn of Everything that women play the role, kind of grand role, of the authors of all of science at some point in that book, which also, in his usual style, there's all kinds of cartoonish language, and that seems to be one of them. And whenever, I have to just be candid. Whenever Grieber analyzes a society in terms of how it treats women or uses women, and they're the object of the sentence, I don't know quite what to do. There's something about only women in the equation get treated a certain way, right? Like in the way that we think about free societies as one where women are treated well, like allowed XYZ privileges. I just don't feel like the female characters, honestly, in this or in the other works, get the robust subjectivity that the male characters get. So even the kind of happy idea that there ultimately is the women that are the fences, isn't that great? It sounds a little bit like cheerleading for half the population. And I'd like to see an idea of what it looks like to have a feminist critique that they also encountered on the island, and what that might have yielded in a robust way that added to the Enlightenment. So I'm not sure what to do about when women, just as a monolith, appear in Graeber's works. It's not altogether true. It's not. I like a lot in The Dawn the way that he revives some of the goddess and mother worship anthropology of that we everyone seemed to reject in the 70s by women. I like that a lot, but I don't hear the women in the book treated as intellectuals. Right? It's like, how did they design cities? How did men design cities? How did they treat women? How did they treat animals? How did they treat each other? How did they treat the law? How did they treat women? They're just not agents in the way that I would expect him to be able to pull off. He can't do everything in a book of this length, but that's where I get sort of tripped up on his account of women.
Yeah, I think in this book, one of the reasons why that probably ends up being the case is there are few, if any records of you know, the Madagascar perspective, like that second part. There's the second part of the book kind of focuses on, okay, what were, from the Madagascar perspective, the impact of the pirates coming in. But the accounts that we have are like from men almost exclusively, and some of them are just idiots who believe anything that someone tells them, and others are, you know, and they're taken for rides by some of the pirates who are trying to, you know, convince them that there's an elaborate kingdom or an empire at work here, that they're king. And other times it's also because the stories that we do get where women appear are, you know, stories where it's some cautionary tale that you're supposed to avoid the Madagascar women, that, you know, they'll use magic to, you know, get revenge on you or to get you to fall in love with them.
And also, sorry, one more thing is that these descendants are all, none of them are descendants, let's say, of women native to the island with, men native to the island with women who came in as pirates. So we're only talking about what is took as a wife, or probably, possibly in some forcible rape situation, and they're very young. And so somehow to think that that was like a beautiful flowering of a new society, like it just seems worth holding up, that a purloined princess is not like a fun thing in a fairy tale, as much as more sexual violence. And I know Graeber, toward the end of his life, or at least maybe 5 years before he died, 4 or 5 years, just had a moment of revelation. It's very interesting, written in The Guardian, about how surprised he was to understand that rape is very common. It's just a simple thing, but he just took the time to say, wow, this is very common. I thought this was an exotic event. You know, that's certainly something that should be woven into any story of how these descendants come to be come to hold this repository of new ideas.
Yeah, no, I would say, I mean, I do think that in that section there is a sort of acknowledgement that this is still not like there's a good system in there. It's horrifying. Like there is a story, well, you know, as an example, one of the stories he tells is when he's trying to describe a tradition where women are used as political tokens, and he's talking about how a child is offered up to a pirate as you know, someone for them to marry immediately, and I don't think that, or you know, when it's described, it's he's talking about how this is a practice that comes also from a history of sexual mores, of conservatism on the island that is abhorrent and gets, you know, is the result of some of the uprisings, you know, that the sexual revolution that spurs some of what he points to as exciting developments is in part because, you know, in Madagascar society, if women before the revolution were you know, pregnant before they were married, they would get stoned or they would get drowned. Or if, you know, in specific parts of the island also, when there were Madagascar, you know, waves of Madagascar waves of Muslim refugees to Madagascar, that if you also could improve the lineage of a child as being like some Christian, I mean, as a Muslim, or, you know, a Muslim that wasn't a heretic, that they would also kill the mother. And that part of the changes to be pointed to that he was interested in are ones where, you know, people rose up and organized against that and ended up crushing it until there was the backlash by the warrior princes and by the other, you know, male sources that we have who said, oh, actually, like this new way of doing these things and the power that some of these cities have, as well as the influence of the pirates, we don't like it, we want to purge it, you know, more or less.
Actually, maybe we should turn to questions.
Sure. I mean, one kind of broader question that I had for all of you guys that we've touched on a little bit, but not directly, is in what spirit should we be reading this book? Because he sort of says up front, this really should be taken as a provocation. But then he also says that it should be read as a work of history. And then he later says, well, we're not really sure if any of this happened, so let's just proceed as if this had happened and discuss it that way. So the whole thing is in a sort of like counterfactual mode. I mean, as he admits, there's virtually no evidence for any of the things that he's writing about. You know, we have this account that was probably written by Defoe. Like one of the main, like essentially the only primary document he has was published 100 years after the events in question, collected from a series of interviews that had been conducted 60 years after the events in question. None of the chronologies for any of this really line up in any meaningful way. So, you know, how are we, and, you know, part of the book is about how pirates use the power of these fables that they told about themselves. I mean, so how are we supposed to read this book? I mean, it seems like he gives us latitude to interpret it however he wants. There's a lot of kind of plausible deniability. There's some Mott and Bailey moving back and forth between how seriously we're supposed to take it. I mean, there are times where it seems like the whole thing is totally made up. I mean, which doesn't mean it's not electrifying to read. But how did you guys decide to read it?
Let's go.
Go for it. I hate to lower the tone of the proceedings, but at some point during the book, I did think about Madagascar, the animated film, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and of course the standout character, King Julian. Remember, I like to move it. I like to.
You gonna get up and do the dance?
Sorry?
Get up and do the dance.
Not unless you pay me. So he was, you know, he was a party animal, but also he was the king of the lemurs. And actually, by corollary, the king of Madagascar. And it turned out that he indeed was also a mock king. He was self-appointed. And had no real authority except, you know, by the example of his dance moves. And then I looked up lemurs, the social structure of lemurs, and found there was a matriarchy. You couldn't actually have a king of lemurs. So I just wanted to say that because I do think that David would have appreciated that, and I'm mortified that he didn't put that in the book. So that's one way of reading it. I can only imagine how others will read it. Scholars have always pushed back against his work because of its provocation, and scholars are very territorial. You know, they're like wild beasts on their turf if they feel threatened, and they will push back, and they have done, and they will do with this book. Others will find their own, others will find lines of inquiry to follow up on. Maybe someone will write that book that Virginia was mapping out, which is a feminist critique. And others... Others, although I find it difficult to imagine this, how movements of action could follow from a book like that. I mean, David has written books that have inspired action and movement work. It's difficult for me to imagine how that would come out of this, though.
I mean, I've forgotten now. This is a great question, Gideon, but I've forgotten all the things that he says this is. I don't know what you said, a provocation maybe, or a treatise. But I think at the part where he says, I hope the reader has as much fun as I did, he starts that by saying, let us tell then a story about magic, lies, sea battles. I mean, you know, anyone who's read an 18th century novel knows that the novel itself is born in this Moll Flanders being the true story of a, you know, whatever, fallen woman who's something, that these are all of them. Robinson Crusoe was supposed to be a true story. So he's living definitely in the flicker between, what makes this fiction so good is that I'm going to, you know, swear up and down that it's true. And, you know, men and women coming back during the Age of Discovery, coming back from islands, especially islands where there were sexual opportunities and violence, and then telling the stories of them is, you know, that's the birth of Melville. That's the birth of so many of those adventure writers. And that's why these stories were circulating in Europe. I mean, they were just awesome tall tales. At the same time, I think it's only the burden's on him only to show that our straight story of the Enlightenment, where we have Locke and Adam Smith and David Hume, and that they're somehow talking through, they're doing panel discussions like this. If there's an empire at the same time where some of those ideas are colliding with other ideas, and all he needs to do is shake our story of the Enlightenment. I don't think that he has to document every piece of it. If by the end of this kind of swirling story of magic and so on, he gets you to think, if everyone was talking about this, and why wouldn't they have been? They're amazing stories. It can't have been that the Enlightenment thinkers, the thinkers that we associate with the backwaters of France and England, were not shaken by it. Also, the one thing I'll say is we might say a word at least about the real Libertalia, the second title, I guess, because Libertalia is an imagined place where pirates are free and anarchic and give in to their appetites, and then this is about the real Libertalia. So I think there's something of the contradiction that the question's getting at.
I would say I think that we have more than it would seem like, even though that we are operating off a lot of conjecture, reconstruction. Like we do, the main things that we know and that he lays out is that we know that pirates came to Madagascar, that the political structure of Madagascar changed, and that the descendants of those pirates to this day have been some of the most stubborn opponents of authority being imposed on them. And we have, contradictory records that make it clear that people tried to present themselves as kings, even though there were no kings in various areas, that they tried to present themselves to foreign courts as kings, even though there were no kingdoms there. We know that there were some, general changes in social relations and structure. So I think with all of what we do have, we have enough to suggest that something special happened here with the influx of pirates and the fact that they ran their ships a certain way that bled into the island. We know that it sparked off or set off some sort of shifts in the island that persist to this day, and the rest may be plugged in, either from conjecture or from attempt at provocation. But I think that the way I would approach it is, I guess, embrace it, because I'm fine with the agitprop, even if it is not as well supported as we might like, because it pushes forward these ideas that he's been pushing in all of his work, which is that we should be treating people across history who are not white as actual political agents and actors, and that we need to consider the consequences of what pirates would do in some situation if they organized their ships a certain way and they decided to live in another place. What would slaves who were part of these pirate ships do? What would chieftains on the island do in response to these people? And once you start doing that, I think even if the individual arguments and threads and paths that he pursues, if they're entertaining but wrong, prove to be wrong, the critical project of constantly emphasizing that everybody has some idea about how their life should be lived and would like to create a society or be involved in creating society where that life can be realized is something that is left out of a lot of historical analysis and narrative, but not in the books here, and especially not even when the temptation might be to fall in that direction, because there's not a lot of evidence either way to fall back on.
I think now we're going to turn to audience questions. So we've had 2 submitted already, but it's been suggested that I encourage more questions, please. So I think people are coming around to take them on note cards to pass up here. So please ask more questions. So the first 2 questions from the audience, you guys ready? How was wealth and the organization of power maintained in the community?
Our community? in our community?
A big essay question. Awesome. In the real libertalia.
So I think there, if you've read Dawn of Everything, there's this really interesting part where he talks about how the Iroquois, the Wendat, have a mechanism for preventing material power or material wealth from being translated into political power, and that this is done through giving away gifts or by creating systems of reciprocity where you're constantly exchanging material wealth, or in big ritual feast or sacrifices where you burn all of this, you get rid of it. And we see once the pirates start to integrate and ingratiate themselves in Madagascar, something similar, in that, one, you can't launder a lot of the treasure, so you have to get rid of it. One way to get rid of it is the shares that you have among other pirates. And you can consider that as like also a way of a buy-in and ensuring that everybody gets an equal share and is going to work together or stay together, stay loyal to one another. There are also secondary systems where like some of these shares would be split amongst a pirate's wife or many wives. As we kind of talked about or hinted at, some of these cautionary tales that emerged about Madagascar women being like killing or threatening pirates emerged because, the expectation that Graeber reconstructs from some of the records is that if you, betrayed your wife either by, backing out of some business deal or, lying or cheating in a way that was outside of the already pretty, sexually liberal arrangement where you could see other people, then you'd either have your wealth stolen or killed. So I think that in some of the ways in which it was maintained was, there was a kind of quiet threat of losing it all, and then also by insisting that it should be distributed amongst everybody else, and then also as they were connecting to Madagascar natives, the need to distribute it or share it with other people, sometimes in rituals, sometimes in spectacles, and then sometimes it's just like a buy-in to ensure that they remained allies.
I mean, one passage that might kind of answer that question is he writes, just to summarize a little bit, that he's quoting an ethnographer who was saying that there must have been other values, prestige, hospitality at play in female Malagasy's embrace of foreigners. And then he says, to these I would add another, freedom. Earlier I remarked that the pirates arrived with much economic capital, but virtually no social or cultural capital. But from the perspective of a potential partner, even the latter has obvious advantages. First, pirates, like other foreigners, didn't arrive with mothers or other family members to interfere with a wife's decisions. Second, they came with almost no relevant social knowledge, not even usually the ability to speak a language most people around them understood. This put their female partners in the position not just of intermediaries, but of mentors, if obviously in a classically gendered way. Insofar as these female partners were not or were no longer teenagers living in their father's homes, this also gave them an opportunity to effectively recreate local society. And with the creation of the port towns, the transformation of sexual mores, the eventual successful promotion of their children by the pirates as a new aristocratic class, this is precisely what they were able to do. And then on the next page, there's a description of a ship's quartermaster shows up, and he was the child of a Martinique planter and a slave mother. And one of the women, this is in the far south of Madagascar, in Fort Dauphin, where the French had tried to set up a colony that failed. One of the women in that town claims that this guy who just showed up on a ship was her long-lost son. And then they essentially make him the puppet king so that she can run the show from behind the scenes. And Graeber comments, by adopting a clueless outsider who could only be entirely dependent on her for his knowledge of local politics and catapulting him into a position of supreme power, the princess launched a coup that, despite those patriarchal restrictions, put her effectively in charge of the kingdom. So that's one answer, I think, to the question that was asked. We have more questions. Okay. From the discussion this evening, it sounds like the book is essentially doing the same thing as The Dawn of Everything. Is the book a distillation extension of that project, or is there a distinct argument? Do you want to come answer?
So it's actually in introduction, David writing that this book is a part of the trilogy. It starts from There Never Was the West, then it's a Dawn of Everything, and this is Pirate Enlightenment. So it's a big project of decolonizing enlightenment. And I think that's also answer of if you can use this book as a inspiration for the action, because if we actually decolonize enlightenment, as David was saying, revolution is when there are transformation of the common sense. So that's what we need to do, transform the common sense outside also of academic communities, just to everyone.
Thank you. We have a question here for Eddie in particular. Edward, in Dawn of Everything, Graeber shows that which he already said in anarchist anthropology, the use of imagination. In your current work, do you see these counterfactual tales as necessary toward creating a desired world? Specifically, and then it just trails off.
Yeah, I think they're like really important. You know, I write a lot about tech, and I think one of the things is in tech, there's almost every vision, alternative framework that we have for analyzing tech is pretty much one that is from a very narrow set of assumptions given to us by billionaires who have every reason to like advance a certain way of seeing the world. And the only way to really, at this point, entertain alternatives is also engaging counterfactuals or consider like just, you know, what sort of world would we have if we pursued this alternative way of developing technology, or if we didn't have this technology. And similarly with, you know, with these books and Dawn of Everything, I mean, Dawn of Everything has a lot of really fascinating segments where you have societies that are just run on totally different ways of limiting power. You have kings who don't have any ability to tell you what to do outside of, you know, a few hundred feet. You have massive rituals that, you know, destroy like hoarded up wealth that maybe some particularly industrious person in the tribe might have accumulated. You know, you have all sorts of ways of living that one way or another we are told were not possible, aren't possible. And if we constructed it then the question is like, you know, what would it look like now, and what's the reason we can't do a certain alternative that goes far against, you know, what our institutions, what we've been told we're allowed to do now. I think the counterfactuals are important in just like getting people to ask the question, because we really don't tend to ask the question. What we tend to do is like, how can we improve this pretty fucked up situation, instead of like, how do we break away from it completely and you know, invent something new.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? So there was, in I think 2014, there was kind of a famous conversation between Graeber and Peter Thiel, in which Graeber starts out by saying, like, to my great surprise, I actually kind of agree with a lot of things Peter said. And then, of course, he goes into where he doesn't agree. But at the beginning of this book, he goes out of his way to identify himself in this book as part of a left libertarian tradition. But he doesn't really expound on that. What does that mean to you, his identification with the left libertarian tradition?
So I think the left libertarian tradition is you know, essentially anarchism. And the idea there is, you know, the early classical liberal theories about power and state power and state rule criticized accumulations of power because they would limit human autonomy or agency. and turn people into things that were lesser than themselves, either make them, either an extension of appendage of its ability to project force or violence, or either just like reduce them to their labor. And so you would want to oppose these concentrations of private power because of their ability to limit human beings. The modern right-wing libertarians follow the reasoning, but don't apply it to to corporations. They keep it limited to state rule, and they insist that corporations are a different type of private power, and one way or another we can find autonomy and agency through them in the marketplace, and that states are the real issue here. And I think left libertarians continue to apply the logic and say, well, it's still the states and corporations and any real accumulation of power and autonomy gets agency at your own expense, and we want to dissolve them and interrogate whether they're legitimate and whether they're not legitimate. So I think that's the left libertarian one, just arguing that authority systems and structures should be examined and dissolved when they're not found to be legitimate, or when they're found to be antithetical to like humans being free and able to control their own destinies.
Sometimes he says Enlightenment ideas are, he breaks down places on the edge of empire that are the source of various parts of the Enlightenment. And this one is really where Kandiarank and the Wendat might have partly been responsible for some kind of egalitarianism or democracy. This is much more tracing the roots of civil liberties. And I think that may be what he means. The pirates weren't modeling egalitarianism or some kind of socialism as much as personal freedoms and civil liberties. I'm really interested in his point about bureaucracy being inherited from China. I don't know if he's done that work exactly, but the deep state is the 17th century China.
You mentioned Peter Thiel, and I agree with Edward's delineation of left-wing libertarianism. I mean, until the 1970s, when you mentioned libertarian, it basically meant anarchist. What we've really seen in the last few decades is the outgrowth, of course, of right-wing libertarianism. And a lot of these people, Thiel and others, are the pirates of today, essentially. I mean, they're the ones that are stealing the wealth and squirreling it away. And they have their havens, in the Caribbean and other parts of the world. Yes, seasteading. They have their go-to, escape havens, either on Earth or in space, and so on and so forth. They really don't. The 1% are the pirates, and they don't have a culture that I think is admirable in any way whatsoever. But if you were writing a story about pirates today, then it would be tales of Peter Thiel and his comrades he would be telling, and maybe there's something there. Maybe there's another book there.
Do we have time for another question? Okay. Doesn't Graeber underestimate the Enlightenment? Many authors did openly use foreign society as an influence, see Voltaire or Montesquieu. The Enlightenment synthesizes these ideas in a way none of these societies did.
So you mean that decolonizing it loses something, or that there is something in our old story of Western civ that needs to be preserved?
I don't know.
You don't know.
Wasn't my question.
Yeah.
I can't speak for what the questioner meant.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly how to come at it.
I think in the early pages, in the preface of this, Graeber argues that we shouldn't, or that he doesn't see himself as fitting into some sort of anti-Enlightenment tradition, because a lot of really important ideas come out of what we associate with the Enlightenment. What he's trying to do is push back against the idea that these theories about how to organize our lives are solely the providence of European philosophers, and that it makes sense if you just take seriously the idea that people have been thinking about how to run their lives for all of human history. That that it's not a coincidence that these ideas only started really to occur to Europeans once their colonial empires started to stretch across the world and they started to encounter other cultures. That would suggest that there's something in the places where they were, colonizing and interacting with people when they weren't busy killing them, that there was some sort of exchange of ideas or something to make them think about a different way of life. And I don't think that, this project, the trilogy, is not, to decolonize the Enlightenment is not really to say, like, these ideas don't matter. It's to say that we've been having them and thinking about them for a long time, because that emphasizes humanity's ability to think and construct and reorganize political reality. Because if we focus it in on the Enlightenment in this very specific historical period, it just sounds like certain conditions had to align for us to be able to think about another world, but in reality we've been doing it for the entirety of our history.
I think also that's a good point about he's not anti-Enlightenment, which would seem to be a surprise. I mean, I think that's one of his signature innovations, is some idea to reclaim the radicalism of the Enlightenment and occupy that position. But the anti-Enlightenment position that's common on the left right now is to kind of assume this imagined role of sort of tribes that couldn't be assimilated into some monolithic worldview during the heyday of imperialism. And I think what he says is, instead of thinking of insensate, unassimilable groups of people who have backward ways of doing things, they are actually authoring ways of organizing themselves that it becomes the Enlightenment, that feeds the Enlightenment. And so that instead of, he doesn't like just anti. That great thing about a 400-page book about how racist Rousseau is still a 400-page book about Rousseau. This is a great line, and it doesn't. And the same with Montesquieu. So this is not to say, the Mount Rushmore of Enlightenment men all needs to be taken down and in its place put people that, from the margins or whatever. This is rather to say the ideas originated, with these thinkers, not with, in other populations that are just anthropological actors without subjectivity. I just find that very interesting and much more revelatory and radical than the simply anti-Enlightenment position.
That may be because I don't think he thinks in a dialectical fashion, ultimately. And but when it comes down to it, this notion, and obviously that's the goal of the trilogy, this notion that society evolves along certain ways in a linear fashion is very much an Enlightenment paradigm. It's absolutely central to Enlightenment thought. And if you want to cast doubt on that and undermine it and dislodge it, then it's not. I agree, it's not necessarily an anti-Enlightenment position, but it's a fundamental challenge to what is a cardinal principle of social evolution that comes out of the Enlightenment, that you do have that natural progression through history of these social formations, and the dawn of everything was really supposed to be a central attack on that, and to some degree this is a continuation. But so, not anti-Enlightenment, but I don't think a round of applause for the Enlightenment for sure.
I'm not sure that case about some great teleology, I assume you were doing like the stages of man or whatever, that he obviously wants to leave behind, and the idea that people proceed by revolutions in our agriculture and industry, also he takes issue with. But the ideas of the Enlightenment, which he then sees as inherited from, appropriated from, bastardized from, translated from, the Wendat, the Turkish civilizations. I think you can have one without the other, right? I mean, I think you can have the ways that the pirates organized their society independent of some idea that it was like better, things were getting better and better, and things had once, you know, he takes issue, as you all know, he takes issue with both that some idea that we were some Hobbesian state of war and the idea that it was some Rousseauvian paradise of innocence. Neither of those are, you know, is he in sync with, and yet he still thinks the Enlightenment ideas are good ones. And also he has that great line in the, oh, you don't know, but he had this great line in the beginning where he says, you know, the Enlightenment is now associated with imperialism and exploitation and subjugation and scientific racism. He puts that in quotation marks. But it could be that people would do these same exploitative, subjugative, imperialist gestures under the banner of religion like they did for hundreds of years. I mean, it could be that those impulses were not like liberated by the Enlightenment, but that was just yet another way to frame them. So I mean, I think I mean, Nika probably knows better than we do, but I find him to be very redemptive for Enlightenment ideas, or at least, yeah. And what a funny thing, like kind of what a just strange gesture for such a wild mind to be interested in, of all things, democracy, you know.
All right, well, I think that is a lovely place to end. So thank you so much to Virginia, Eddie, and Andrew. Thank you to Joel and the library. And thank you so much to Nika for being here with us.